have not yet heard, to your point, someone that has the opposing thesis and says, hey, yeah, no, maybe centralization works, but shoot, man, you know how hard it is to get third-party people to work together and be willing to centralize? I've got this one owner that says he loves to be the guinea pig, and I'm going to take their properties and add 20% to payroll budget.
One of the hardest things about risk and innovation is knowing how long you're really going to need to establish, those outcomes and then have something to make a decision on.
Okay, welcome to the Digible Dudes Podcast. I'm David.
I'm Reid.
Reid, you are at home for the first time in a long time. I didn't tell you this morning, but our nanny texted us this morning and was like, oh, my family's sick. We don't have fevers, but Griffin's welcome to come. And Nicole and I were like, oh, shoot, do we come in or not? And I looked at my schedule. I was like, well, I have to do the podcast. I don't want to do that remote. So I guess Griffin's going to go right into the fire of the germ fest. And what do you know? You're at home. So
I feel bad about that, and I don't, because I know we can manage. But I also thought about coming in just for the sake of the podcast, but I went the other direction. Was like, nah, Dave will be okay if I stay here this morning.
Yeah,
I'm recovering to some degree from the weekend with my sister and my nephew in town, but I shared with the group, this morning, that we went to the Broncos game, and I screamed my head off as if it was the Super Bowl. I was really just trying to get the second one of the season. But yeah, we had a late night last night, and then I wanted to see her off this morning, and I was just like, "How the hell with it? I'll stay here."
Well, that's the point.
Yeah, exactly right. So I am, checking that box as far as leadership showing it's okay. Typically I do go in, but last week we had the wall demo, so everybody was remote, and that was weird. I had a little PTS, but there was also some things that I had good memories of during the pandemic when we were all remote. And part of it was actually you. Like, I did get a kick out, whether they landed or not, but your commentary and chat to meetings. And so you're always good for a couple of off-the-cuff comments or Staley humor. But just the level of engagement, that you see when everybody has to work remotely.
It's weird like that, but when we have an all-hands meeting, our chat lights up if it's remote versus if it's like half and half, the chat is way less active. So I would have thought that being remote meant people are more multitasking or whatnot, but instead it seems like if you can keep the chat fun, I feel like they're actually getting more out of it. I don't know that to be true, but it just feels as if they're getting more out of it.
I think they get more out of it, like culturally, like it's good for like kind of just camaraderie and, banter, just keeping things a little bit lighter. But the worry I had during the pandemic that I would still have or did last week was once that chat starts to really go, it's like, is anybody paying attention to what whoever is talking about, because we're going through slides and then you see like all the comments and reactions, and it's like, yeah, did you actually hear anything that was just said? But I don't care, because we're not fully committed to one or the other, and that's what we're happy about at Digible is we offer a lot of optionality.
Yeah, well, to your point on being at home, we've been doing so much work to our house, and now we're thinking like, we should maybe work an extra day a week at home. Also, obviously, like I love the office benefits, but then I love like having just like deep work time at home and not getting distracted. So I do think a flex schedule or whatever is best for me. And then this will take us into a little bit. I'll use it as a terrible, if you will, segue into the topic, but we were talking about risk a few episodes back, and there's more that we wanted to get to there. And part of that was one of the topics we wanted to get to was innovation, like risk of innovating or risk of not innovating. And so my bad segue here is like risk of having fully remote versus not fully remote, and also like the impact that has on culture and the impact that has on brainstorming, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot there. So I don't know if like in a different world, I'd be advising us to take a hard stance versus, as we've always said, like you can't really going in the middle. You don't get any of the benefits of either, right? Like if we forced all in office or we forced all remote, you could then argue we're getting the benefit, but we're almost compromising by having the flex. Anyways, I'll let you comment on that, and then you can pick my segue, shamble up, and make it a real one
I was gonna
into
say, I don't have a
innovation.
great comment for that, and that was not your best segue. I'll just, hashtag authenticity.
Well, if you say the word segue, it just counts, right? Like there, that it,
Yeah, I guess so.
all is forgiven. Yeah,
Yeah, well, I'll try to pick that up and
thank you.
say, we're, I think by most accounts, meaning our employees would say, very innovative culture, and whether it's directed at our employees or directed at our product and our services, ultimately to our customers, we are always trying to experiment and see if we can find a better way of doing things, and that is what led us to the structure we're in right now with the work from anywhere policy. And I think it is the best, but it's expensive, and that is part of risk, right? And you can't lose sight of that either. How much are you willing to spend when it comes to innovation, um, and how much are you willing to risk? And I mean this in a monetary standpoint. Not that we have to start there, but a lot of things are presented, especially when it comes to innovation, and you don't have that hard ROI really fleshed out, especially in the early stages. And that's what makes somebody, in our case, like Ryan, who runs our finances, anxious, and rightfully so. It's like, how long, can, uh, we, air quotes here, innovate or try things and not see that ROI before we, move on to the next thing. So you always advocated for, let's just agree on some type of R&D budget and not put too much accountability on it so that we don't get so consumed by it that, we somehow sabotage like what we're trying to do here, which is learn, right? And also foster a really great culture. And I think that's true, but I do think that there's some limits to how kind of far you can uh, take that, principally.
Yeah, it's hard. Like this. Well, I swear we'll get to innovation, but the first thing you made me think of with that is when we look at our budgeting process for this next year, we have like, okay, we should spend X amount on learning and development, and Y amount on developing this one product, and blah blah blah. So where I'm going with that is like back to my no compromise. Would we be better off in a way just like totally spending all extra budget on education for the team versus spreading it out among like these other culture initiatives and these other like innovation opportunities? And I guess I don't know the right answer to that for us. I feel like we are so like we have such an appetite, and we don't get satisfied easily, then it's easy for me to be like, no, we should spend on some on education. We should spend some on, conferences, and we should spend some on, developing a new product. So if that's the case, in a way, we're just making everything slightly better. And I guess like 1% better is better. But we're not really taking any big back to like cannonballs. We're not doing any large cannonballs at any of these either risk or innovation categories. Well, I was just saying, like, we haven't chosen a category to do a cannonball at, meaning like educating our employees or innovation for like tech. So, but anyway, since we wanted to talk more about innovation, um, the R&D budget, I think it was a safe way to do it. It's almost like Jack Welchian, meaning like the famous CEO of GM, where it was more of a blanket. Hey, let's invest 5% every year into R&D because then we're checking the box and knowing that we're never forgetting about it. However, I'm sure you could be better and like throttle that up and down each year if you had someone that you trusted being. It's like if we had Sir Dyson, at our company. It's like, okay, I'm going to trust Sir Dyson to know when he should be leaning more into R&D versus not. But Digible doesn't have a Dyson, right? So therefore, I lean more towards let's make sure we're always doing something experimental. And then we've got to decide our appetite for risk when trying the experimental. So a good example of that this year was us leaning into automation for our internal systems. We did not bubble test as much as you like to say, Reid, on like how we were innovating on operationally, and instead we kind of were more heavy handed and said, all right, this is what's going to happen across the board. And now as we've gotten most of the way through the year, we're like, okay, maybe we overdid that a little bit and we should pull back. and stick with what we know what works, and then revisit. So yeah, I guess based on our experience now, how do you stand on like completely novel innovations for digital moving forward versus trying to take something that we're doing today and thinking different?
Yeah. Um, so you're saying when you say novel versus like kind of full bore, is that like trying to understand that distinction? Like how we think about it or appetite for kind of the uh rapid, like smaller tests versus bringing out the cannon?
My novel was more around, like, our NLG. That was, like, something novel, it didn't exist for us before, now we wanna do this, let's pursue this, versus, how do we pace campaigns? And, hey, we could build automation around this, that's some R&D, some innovation, but, it's something that we know we do every day. So, there's a difference between, I think, shoring up, like, the stuff you already do and almost, like, testing the fences like the Raptors versus like, "Hey, let's see if we can even, like, make dino DNA," right? Uh, there's a difference to me there about how a company should operate, and I could totally defend either one, that you wanna be the novel company or that you wanna be the one that just keeps, honing your hedgehog, if you
Yeah.
would.
Yeah. No, I fully understand where you were going with that. I think um, this isn't using a recent discussion we had about when it comes to operating top line versus EBITDA and how that changes your strategy and more than just strategy. Is this meaning a binary? Is this that example where it's like because most people that either have ran a company or been in operations or on finance understand it's very difficult to do both of those, to drive growth, but also still maintain or put a priority on your profitability. So is that true when it comes to novel, like, just things that haven't existed, at least at your company, or don't exist at all versus the fine tuning you're talking about? I'm going to say that I think you can do both. It's more what level, like, or amount is the pendulum swinging to the novel versus like the fine tuning. And maybe in a certain year, even most of what you're doing is fine tuning versus taking shots at things that, just don't exist. But that would change for sure, like some of like how you're operating. I'd like Digible to do what it's been doing for the most part. You're right. We don't always shoot the bullets or haven't been great about that with, like our campaign optimizations. I think there's something to be said psychologically, and, maybe this is fair still to connect to risk, but when we took the risk of going a 4-day work week, instead of a bullet, I said, I don't want this to be viewed as a test. And I think that did change the vibe, mostly for the better. But you can't. I don't think it's a good idea to do that too often, where you just completely commit yourself to a certain um, area of innovation. But there are things that take longer to prove out. And if they're a really big part of your organization, like campaigns are for us, then I think it's more understandable to, you know, I guess, put forward a greater amount of risk slash commitment, as far as innovating and trying to improve, because you just know it's not going away. I mean, we've said that a million times. Like, we're not going to abandon that part of our business ever. And so we should always be trying to innovate there. It's just more what's the best approach to do that so that we don't get too far down the road in one area that we find out really was, you know, a poor use of our resources.
Well, let me ask you this thought experiment then, make you raise your game a smidge today. The,
I don't know if this is the day to do that, but I'll play along.
Coca-Cola versus New Coke, right? Like, they've got their recipe, and they totally learned their lesson about New Coke, and innovating on that, like, model. So, what would you call Digible's Coca-Cola versus where would we be misstepping and moving into New Coke territory?
Yeah, I think I can actually get that one pretty quick. Um, so I would say our Coca-Cola is our service business and the experience that our clients have working with Digible. So I'm kind of setting our tech, especially, our subscription, like our Fiona platform, as well as some of the other things we're doing around fair housing or Google Posts, just so I'm being really clear. This is more like our day-to-day running campaigns and helping our marketers and operators lease up their buildings. So I think that is our Coke, the combination of how we run those campaigns and the experience people have through that process. And then I think our was it Coke Zero. What did you say? The
New Coke.
new Coke would be moving. I won't name names, but to a almost entirely automated experience or approach of running our campaigns and even the touch points along the way. So we've already made it clear with our SMAC recipe, which is our operating code for the next couple of decades. At least that's the way that we went into it, and saying that we'd always maintain one point of contact. But what we didn't say is just how much they own versus, let's say, a chatbot or something. Um, so therefore, new Coke to me would be if we radically adopted or went all in on a more automated experience and approach to managing our campaigns.
Yeah, and by my example, I'm saying that would be the bad move, right? So, like, Coca-Cola, shouldn't have changed their recipe because people loved it, and then they, wanted to change it to New Coke, and that's what caused all the backlash, and they had to then retread on it. For us, though, what I'm gonna take is what, you said is like, okay, the service, and handholding is what is part of our SMAC today. If we went pure chatbot, for example, so your one point of contact is a chatbot, that would probably not go well. We'd probably see the same, rebellion that Google or that Coca-Cola had. But Coca-Cola still worked on their infrastructure, their automation, like for how to make more gallons. Then they probably don't even think in gallons. They probably think in, I don't know. I'm just thinking how people think of like computer people.
Militons.
Yeah, exactly, like teraflops or something. I mean, they're, like, thinking much larger scale of, sugar water creation, but I would say, like, they've certainly branched out with other brands and white labeling their product and blah, blah, blah in other ways, and so that's where, Digital shouldn't mess up a good thing in this case, like, it would be poor to maybe probably to, like, heavy-handedly, like, move into a different customer service model than we have today. But, the back end is something that we could innovate on, and there's less risk there.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. I mean, we definitely more than discussed, and I think we will be bringing this product, but not specifically, and maybe not ever, I don't know, on the service side, but to the self-service like platform where somebody can engage with Digital or you know go as far as like transact, do business with us, and never talk to somebody. Um, but I know that's not really the intent. It's more like if you're working with us and have an interest in expanding the relationship, like, adding properties, for example, that you'd be able to do that without a lot of effort, which I think's, great. It's important. The expectations when it comes to working with service providers is, it's in most cases, I think, is getting higher, but it's so hard because not everybody is as far along in, what level of automation they're comfortable with, can accept, or even want. I think good examples of that are real pertinent to the multifamily industry is, not everybody does want that chatbot. You and I have had this discussion a few times, I feel like probably on the podcast, but where actually all they want is just to talk to that leasing agent. It's like all this other stuff is great, but I just want to talk to somebody. And but then I also have heard personal polling with many of our employees that have relocated to Denver or have moved within Denver. Hey, tell me about your experience. It's just, I think, a good thing for us to ask, and I'm curious. And many of them have griped about being forced to talk to somebody. you know, it's just like, yeah, I didn't need to do that. Like, I don't need to hear the pitch. Like, just make this as easy as possible. I want to be able to schedule. I want to be able to get everything I can and never have to actually have a conversation with somebody on site. So my point there is that makes it really hard to know, just how much to innovate, how much we might want to change. So it just requires incredible amount of diligence and vigilance, work on product feedback, because you're not going to get it fully right. You have to be prepared for some trade-offs when you think about innovation and um, what that translates to from a risk standpoint.
Yeah, well, maybe moving it towards multifamily since you brought it up. If I'm a marketer um, at a company, I don't know that I would. Well, I guess it depends how much I'm thinking about the company's stance versus my own stance. Like, Reid, I'm thinking about like when you came into the post, you definitely were expected to do some innovation. Like, but you were tasked with that. I think regardless if you had been tasked with that, you would have still steered that direction, said, "Hey, I need to like, shake the waters a little bit." Um, versus at a multifamily company, I'd say it's probably healthy for the marketer to know what the company wants. So are they a company that's like, "Look, we're like a bank. We don't want any ruffling of feathers. We want just execute the playbook and hit NOI." Versus, like, some companies, like, I'll even think of like a Bozzuto, UDR, Camden, some of these folks that are like, "Hey, they purposefully wanna lean more into the innovation," but they've also got structured programs. So, it about how they go about whether it's an innovation team or a committee or just a corporate directive. So if you don't have that and someone's stepping into a role, do you think it makes sense I guess, how do you think it makes sense to approach that, almost like entrepreneurially? Like, do you ask permission first, or do you just sort of feel it out and make your call? Um, yeah, what would you do now?
I would definitely ask first. I wouldn't want to be inadvertently disruptive, which happens a lot, especially if you have I'll say somebody that's very risk prone or loves to try new things. And definitely have had that experience myself at a couple of companies before we started Digible. And, I learned from one to the next, how to do that a little bit more effectively. Most companies, I would even say multifamily, do have some risk tolerance or belief in innovation. But the sooner that you can understand, what the gradient of, I guess, or size of that appetite, the better. But I think you mentioned the entrepreneurship, just some really sound frameworks would go a long way, and I would always do that, I guess, moving forward. If I was in that situation and just say, what exists today? Is there anything we might want to revise, or do we need to build this from the ground up? And then work with stakeholders on, okay, now we have, a way to approach this. Next step is determine, what that risk uh, um, level is at this company or organization, and
Yeah.
that's the best that you can do. But it's so valuable to culture. I mean, not to jump over to the who book or hiring and all that, but A players like working with A players, and I think part of that is finding people that aren't strictly execution, but are also forward thinkers. So I don't know why I'm taking this detour, but I'm just saying, like, I think it's so important for cultures that if that doesn't exist at all, good luck in hiring and retaining top talent.
Yeah, I think, that's the wise way to do it. I remember, like, when I was at Hearst, there wasn't, like, a directive as far as, like, how at the local or regional level we were supposed to be innovative, but I could tell that they were just getting frustrated because they didn't have anyone, like, pushing the envelope there. So there were certain departments where it was definitely more well accepted. I'd say the downside was you didn't get support. So you were kind of allowed to do whatever you wanted, like it's kind of like the Wild West. But the most you would ever the most help you'd ever get is like, oh yeah, no, you can have a Google Sheets account so that you can like connect these dots and go ahead and put a Zapier on your P card or something. But outside of that, you were never going to get like real technical resources to do something. And so it's almost like it was a great environment where as a playground, if you needed to experiment and try out. But I could never have really stayed there and made much progress if I was like really if innovation was part of my career. I would have needed to like take my learnings about like influencing others and gathering the troops or whatever, safe environment to test, but then go somewhere else where it does give a directive of where they're like, we are hiring an innovator to come in and disrupt X, Y, and Z, blah, blah, blah. Um, and then sort of glomming on a little bit to what you said about the Who book, like if I was at the point I was at now, if I was getting sucked into a position or pulled into hired someplace, I feel like I would want a very clear directive. I wouldn't want someone to just say, "Hey, carte blanche, go disrupt." I also kind of get like sick just with that word, but instead it'd have to be like, our goal is X. Are you willing to take that on? Because yeah, I just am not willing to. I feel like I'm more about laser focus at this point on what I'm gonna be working on versus just hey, go do better.
Yeah, totally. Well, I've said this a couple of times since I read the book, but one of my favorite excerpts from Bob Iger's Ride of a Lifetime, the Disney CEO, was when he talked about how important it is to innovate where you're winning. And I think he called out like Pixar, and he took over, and everybody's like, they walk on water, and just kind of let them be there. And that was post acquisition, or maybe it was during the process. But what he came to discover is that they desperately needed to innovate at their kind of, call it, core competency if they were going to stay on top. And I think that's one of the hardest things to recognize and really follow through on. I mean, not a lot of people just don't understand that or wouldn't think that. And then even if they do, it's like, but are you actually demonstrating, an effort, to innovate, maintain a certain amount of risk, even you could say, with messing with like a core product or a competency. And yeah, I think that there's a lot of examples of that in our industry, where, hey, we're having a lot of success with this strategy, and specifically in marketing and advertising, of like putting this much, into ILSs, this much into paid search. So just using the media mix as an example, like we found success. And now we're going to move on to the next thing. It's like, but isn't this kind of a moving target? And, there's so many variables that factor into that success. Like, is it okay to really, move your eye somewhere else? And certainly you need to have focus through innovation. So you can't always be keeping your eye or innovating in all areas. But I just think that's a great call out. And in particular for this industry, because I think it's so easy when you got so many things on your plate, to ignore or not innovate where you're doing well.
Yeah, I'd say you need. I would, if I was on the other side of the house, I'd be looking at my scorecard. Like, meaning, first of all, start measuring the important parts of the funnel, for example, if I'm a marketer. And that would be, like website conversion rate, lead to tour rate, like tour to application rate, blah, blah, blah. And then look within that and say, okay, where can I get the biggest gain by experimenting? So what feels off compared to other industries? And from what I've seen, the biggest thing compared to other industries is that like website conversion rate is way lower in this industry than others. So be like, great, let's take some shots at trying to move this from 2.5 to 5. Because if you do that, that's 100% gain. Versus if your tour to application rate is 60%, you can't double 60%, right? You're not going to get double the gains. Therefore, don't focus on that. So I think there can be some ways like I like Bob Iger's thing and his story and what he was talking about with Pixar at the time, but I think sometimes it's the whole hedgehog thing. How much do you keep working on your Coca-Cola recipe versus how much do you like diversify, if you will? And when you're thinking about innovation, I think I at least like to look at where do I think I can get the biggest gain, the least amount of effort first, and let's like throw some BBs at that, some bullets at that before we swing the cans around.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's fair. I think, adjacent to this idea of innovating where you're winning or not, or and how much is also kind of these big trends in the industry right now. We got at this at our summit, and I thought it was a fun segment. I mean, or portion of that segment when we were challenging the groups to rethink and unlearn different aspects of the business with more of a slant towards, of course, marketing categories. But one of the things that came up was, how much we should be rethinking or unlearning what a site team looks like, and how much of this centralization should people be leaning into, or how quickly, and what might this look like, 10 years from now? Is everybody going to be centralized? And, that we'll look back in time and be like, yeah, that kind of, happened in the early 2020s. And, now it's a given. But where I'm going with this is like, well, everybody's talking about innovating with centralization and technology. Like these are the two things, the two masts, if you will, that are going to get us there. I would love to see, and this is talk about courage and risk, but if I had a portfolio and I was feeling that pressure from owners and operators, C-suite, to centralize and really be more aggressive in leveraging AI and all that stuff, I'd love to have the environment, I guess, or the trust to say, but give me 2 properties that I'm not going to do that with. I'm not going to keep them the same, but I am not going to go all in on, like, so that's harder when you talk centralization, but it's like, I would say I want to actually hire more employees, and I want to hire top talent. So I'm actually going to ask for an average of 10-20% increase on that side, on payroll, so that I can get who I want to get, if that's necessary, not to assume the worst, but I want to get the top talent, and I want to create a Disney experience. So I'm going to actually ask for 3 more FTEs. And then I want to see who ends up with the better NOI. Like all these properties that have now been moved to centralized and have, maintenance mid parachuting in and out, and, all the rest, and call centers, all this stuff, and chat bots, versus what we could do here on these 2 properties. Because if we give a good enough experience, nobody's going to want to leave. Nobody. They're going to be like, this community is truly it. I'm going to be super non #humility, but say it's as special as Digible, like, because got this great culture. It's like, that was our goal. And what if you went all in on that? What do you think that would look like, the bottom line? Because you could drive up, you'd have to obviously take the right approach, and, both in how much you increased rent and how you message it, all that stuff. Not to make it just about that, but I am going to skip to the NOI, the bottom line. It's like, could I win that bet? And I do better. So that's just a fun, another example of innovating. And in this case, innovating against the grain, instead of like, where are we winning? It's like, I see these huge trends hitting this industry. Just give me 2. Give me 2 properties and let me take a totally different approach. That takes some serious, well, I won't be crass here, but that takes some serious gumption.
Well, I don't know that you have to. So I guess it depends on the scale of your company if you need to do that, back to like risk, because then you're taking 2 risks, right? One, you're going centralized, and one, you're going the other way. And then most companies are going to want a control group, so that that, like, hey, compared to the control group, how did this perform in 2023 or 2024? So, but what I haven't heard, Reid, from like owners or developers, is so in tech or venture capital, there you have all these theses. I have a thesis that we can centralize and improve NOI by 10%, or I have a thesis that we can actually um, add 20% to our staff salaries and improve NOI by 10%. Right. So it's like, basically you could take either thesis and both may be correct. Right? It's like, which thesis do you actually wanna roll with? And to your point, um, this industry is, well, I guess like most, where you have this news cycle hit and everyone starts talking centralization, and then they all start running at centralization. But I have not yet heard, to your point, someone that has the opposing thesis and says, "Hey, yeah, no, maybe centralization works, but shoot, man, you know how hard it is to get third party people to work together and be willing to centralize." I'm actually just I've got this one, owner that says he loves to be the guinea pig, and I'm gonna take their properties and add 20% to payroll budget and see what happens. Or heck, I mean, double payroll budget and see what happens. Because it's not that payroll's not expensive, it is expensive certainly, but, generally speaking, it's not your most, to improve profit, it may be worth like taking 2 quarters and running that test. So I like your possible thesis, and I'm saying maybe it's the whole like venture capital model is you have to be non-consensus and correct, right? So if everyone in property management right now is saying consensus is centralization probably makes sense in the future, but there's a lot of, this must happen first. It's way easier to execute on doubling staff and
Right.
testing that experiment first.
Without a doubt. And I feel like there's still, I know there's numbers floating around, but I feel like there's so many qualifiers about centralization on what to expect. Cause that's my other favorite questions. Like, what are the expectations if you were to do all this? What do you think the outcome's going to be? And then you'd give somebody, I guess, in this case, me, say, okay, now I know what I'm going to be compared against. But those are still, frankly, expectations, not realities. The realities so far, I think haven't been conclusive, not to bring up, he wouldn't mind anyways, but our good friend Aaron Moss, but as, he mentioned, it's like, there's all these tools and all this money that I feel like we keep spending on AI and technology, and I'm just not seeing the savings or, these are huge wins the way that they were pitched. I think a lot of these companies, it's not their fault. They're just trying to bring new technology, but are able to take advantage of the fact that nothing's really been proven or it's not overly conclusive. And so, it's this wave that a lot of tech companies are getting to ride. It's like, it's the FOMO. Do you really not want to try this? Because your four competitors right there are. But I don't know that Aaron has given the green light or did, or would, to, okay, let's do this old school, but let's do it better than it's ever been done before and see how that plays out. The other hard part of this specific comparison or idea is the timeline, for this stuff to play out, which is one of the hardest things about risk and innovation is knowing how long you're really going to need to establish, those outcomes and then have something to make a decision on. Because if you're talking centralization, all that's going to take some time to implement, like you said, and then the adjustment of like the residents, everybody that's involved. Same thing if I were to go Disneyland, add a bunch of payroll, it's like I'm going to need a few years, not 6 months.
I'm in the middle of the biography of Elon Musk, and there's a lot not to like about the fella, but there's some stuff that I found really interesting when it came to how he was producing cars at Tesla. And for the first bit, he was so focused on. He's like, we don't need any humans in the factory. Robotics are good enough. And so we want basically the car to never stop moving and to be fully assembled by robots. And, then he gets to this like crucible moment where the cars are not working really well because some of the robots are having to do the same action 3, 4 times, and it's not, so the reliability is not great. And he just all of a sudden like had this epiphany moment. He's like, okay, for example, one of the things was installing the seal around your window. He's like, that is very challenging for a robot to do because as you go to put the seal in, sometimes part of it falls loose, and a human can see that and then just go and push it back in, versus a robot can't. And so it now needs to go around the thing like 6 or 7 times, and it's very wasteful. And then he went and did it, and he's like, within his second try, he could install it better than the robot could install it. And he's like, well, shoot, can we hire people at $18 an hour to put window seals in? Yes, we can. Also, we no longer have to buy a seven-figure robot that's failing at this multiple times. And so he ended up making a game of it where he went through First of all, he said, question every step. Like, if we're using 4 bolts, why are we using 4 bolts? Who said? And they're like, and if you can't put a name on who said to use 4 bolts, don't use 4 bolts. Use 2 bolts. Use 1 bolt. Like, why are we doing? There's a lot of requirements that get put into the process, and people don't know why they're there. And then after you've questioned everything about the process, now say, okay, what's more affordable, a human or a robot to do it? And then when it's clear a human, you know, is the answer. He was just spray painting the robots yellow, and if you had a yellow X on the robot, they removed the robot from the line. So they actually removed so many robots from their manufacturing line that they had to put a hole in the side of the building to take all these robots out of the building, and they were able to more than double their car production. And he, publicly said, hey, he over relied on automation. They hadn't questioned enough of the process, and humans are actually still really good at some things that robots are not. And then so that he operates by this paradigm where he says question everything and remove as much as you can. And if you didn't learn that you removed 20% too much, you didn't question enough stuff. So basically, he believes in, after you have the thing ready for production, now question all of it. And you should basically remove too much from the process that you're like, oops, yeah, we needed 4 bolts. Yeah, there was a good reason for 4 bolts versus 2 bolts. And then that's a good barometer. So you should expect to overcut, put put 20% back in, and you probably cut enough out. So thought that was a really interesting, thing that Digible can learn from, and perhaps even, some of the audience can learn from.
Yeah. I mean, that one seems like it'd be back to where I left off on the timeline, something that'd be easier, quicker to discover, versus some of these decisions between service, like, you know what I mean? Like
Right.
manufacturing line, like robot versus human
Right.
versus like an on-site, experience, or, for that matter, what we do. But there's aspects of that you absolutely could ask, and just like, let's keep removing, questioning until we get, well, that's the question. Until what? Until, we get to our goals, or until we're convinced that, we've maxed out, like, from an efficiency standpoint.
Well, I think the thing on innovation is, I'll give a different illustrative example for him, but he's obviously believed in self-driving cars for over a decade, and since I think it's like since 2015, he's been announcing that they're going to have a self-driving car by the end of the year. So he's been significantly wrong on this. The other car companies that have been working at this install something like $40,000 worth of equipment on the car in order to make it self-driving. So that's like LiDAR, radars and stuff like this. Whereas he was like, well, you know what? I think humans only use their eyeballs. So I feel like we should be able to make a self-driving car that only uses cameras, like basically eyeballs. So he's not installing really expensive equipment. So if he would have been installing expensive LiDAR equipment since 2015, he would have been like significantly upside down compared to his prediction about self-driving. So I think he's done a good job of like trying to weigh the cost benefit of the innovation component versus, like you're saying, Reid, like, okay, well, we have an assumption if we install LiDAR, we'll get there in 2 years, and then you're wrong by 7 years or 10 years or whatever. And now you're like basically insolvent. So I think I think same thing here. I think my point I'm trying to make is sometimes you don't have to get super fancy with innovation. Innovation can be small things like, do we need 4 bolts or 2 bolts? And then you're causing more productivity. Or it could be, could we use a human instead of a robot? Could that be better productivity or a better human, to your point earlier? And then obviously you can have someone that takes the moonshot and says, oh, we're going to try to use AI for every communication point at this property, or we're going to centralize. But to centralize, we now need to get 100 properties on board versus one property on board. So I think it's picking your lane and deciding where you're going to take your shot for now. And then, to your point, saying, okay, we'll have a check back in 6 months to see if this worked out or not. But some decisions are one-way doors, as Bezos likes to say, versus two-way doors. Like centralization is nearly a one-way door. You move your 100 property portfolio onto centralization, it's really hard to unwind that. You've kind of like, you are committed now to this new paradigm. And if it doesn't work out, man, that was a waste.
Yeah. Well, I liked your, I guess, control with the two risks, meaning you're kind of running two experiments at once, but make sure that you have something in between those two. And that's is that possible with centralization? I think it is, but I could be wrong, or it's like, could we centralize 80% of our portfolio and then
Hmm.
set aside 10 to 15% and leave it kind of where it sits today, and then 5%, let's go radically lean into invest into top talent and potentially more people.
Yeah.
Something else you said though, when you're using the example, the robots and the driverless cars and whatnot. I think one thing I've learned more specifically with changes or innovation related to efficiency is how important it is to communicate upfront that this is not just about saving dollars or certainly replacing jobs or whatever, and just seeing how efficient we can get. Um, we are trying to be, I think I use the term myself, like modern company, thinking progressively. And it was so important. And I just think it is that this will free up more innovation, like the whole flywheel of innovation. It's like, if we can innovate and get really smarter and better about how we do, our daily work, it doesn't have to, and sometimes unfortunately it does, especially, it seems like with some of these bigger companies, but it turns out that there's big layoffs and all that. But the really the better story, the best outcome is that you do that, and it allows people, to focus on, as you say, deep work, or even more ideas. And so you just have this amazing flywheel of innovation that's happening, but it's not with the goal of, replacing, downsizing, humans. That's getting a little bit more profound, or, kind of into the utopian or dystopian view of it. But that's what I would like to see. And that's what we're trying to do at Digible. Because I think
Yeah.
there's been some moments where maybe when we've been pounding that drum and talking about efficiency and automation, that a few people have been like, where does this all go? Like, is this just about, is this profitability? I don't know, just questioning a little bit. It's like, no, we're trying to create this as a culture. And if we do, that should create more happiness and more opportunities for everybody here to do really special work.
Yeah. Well, I think if anything, the property management folks listening should feel pretty safe. There's not like property management is pretty insulated from the developments in technology and AI. You're not going to have like, you can't have like well, even Disney, as you mentioned earlier, getting into property management. You don't, they're not going to come in and all of a sudden take over the market because it's not infinitely scalable the same way, right? Like you still have to build the brick and mortar, you still have to staff it with humans, blah, blah, blah. So I think like they're way more insulated versus companies like us. Like we're still decently insulated versus a company that maybe serves every industry. But like if we were an Amazon like only like marketing company, way more likely that some tool is going to come along that's the easy button for like an e-commerce shop on Amazon, and disrupts us. So we're a little bit more insulated, but still we have more risk than the typical property management company.
Yep.
Well, anything else you want to get to before we wrap it up?
Well, I'll just say for those that managed to listen through all of this, that it may not have been our most organized podcast of all time, but it is a really interesting topic, at least for you and I. And I think it is very important for this industry in particular, whether you're a marketer or operator, to be, evaluating innovation as it and making that connection to risk, and creating, I suppose, your own formula for how that works. As you mentioned, entrepreneurship. I don't know that that's going on a whole lot in this industry, so I'd like to see it happen more. But the only way that I think we will see it, that trend pick up or get established, is if you can understand both sides of it. It's like, you need innovation, but you need frameworks. You need to understand the risk, and that's your best shot of changing a culture and changing an industry. Is to come at it in a very systematic way. Then you're more likely to get what we all know are some very risk averse owners, to support you.
Yeah, well, if that didn't sell you on it, with Reid's galvanizing skills on this one. I don't know who's gonna sell you on the idea.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
just giving you a hard time. All right, well, thanks for. I hope you guys
Yeah,
got something
no
out of
problem.
this, and yeah, we'll see you next week.